Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we saw the end of the reign of Erik of Pomerania. The reign didn't end with his death, natural or assisted, but rather with him being ousted. Humiliating, sure, but at least he got to live. Erik was the last Danish monarch, so far, to have been deposed. His successors on the Swedish throne haven't always been as lucky, but we'll get back to that further down the line. Erik of Pomerania was replaced by his sister's son, Christopher of Bavaria. Christopher was a competent ruler, or at least significantly less incompetent than Erik, and so his reign was mostly characterized by calm and contentment. Unfortunately, it was also rather short. Christopher died young, suddenly, and, crucially, childless in January 1448. Today, we'll get yet another illustration of how weak medieval states often prove to be when a king died with no clear and unchallenged successor. Two contenders, a Swede and a Dane, will fight for Christopher's vacant throne, endangering the future of the Kalmar Union in the process. Episode 63, One King Too Many. When the Swedish aristocrats were gathered in Jönköping, received word that King Christopher was unable to attend the planned meeting with them because he was now dead, they were surprised, sure, but they didn't expect any major complications. No one wanted to break up the union. The Scandinavian peace was great for everyone. The peasants didn't have to suffer incursions or unwanted visits from foreign or domestic armies. They could also enjoy cross-border trade, and so could the merchants who also enjoyed the expanded market of all of Scandinavia. The nobility could manage their estates in the various three kingdoms without any complications, and the trend of marriages across the borders, especially between Danish and Swedish nobles, had also increased, not least under King Christopher. A network of a pan-Scandinavian elite was slowly establishing itself. Still, even though everyone wanted to keep the Kalmar Union intact, a new king would have to be elected, and the Swedish estates were called to a meeting in Stockholm in May to discuss whom Sweden should back in that election. But in the meantime, they did need someone to rule the kingdom, so they appointed not one, but two stewards of the realm, two brothers from the Oxenstierna family. Remember that name, it'll pop up again in future episodes. The brothers were called Bengt and Nils Jönsson. They belonged to the inner circle of nobles who had governed Sweden during King Christopher's reign, and Bengt was the law speaker in Uppland. When the archbishop died soon afterward, in February, Bengt's son Jöns was appointed to succeed him as the most senior cleric in Sweden, giving the Oxenstierna family a dominating position in Swedish politics. But it also placed a large target on their backs, since not everyone was thrilled about one family having so much power, unless, of course, it would have been their own family. Eventually, news that King Christopher had died and a meeting of the estates had been called in Stockholm reached the kingdom's most remote corners. In one of those corners, Viborg Castle in eastern Finland, our old friend Karl Knutsson Bonde greeted the news with glee. Not only was Christopher, who had double-crossed him, dead, but his death gave Karl Knutsson a new chance to insert himself into the center of political life. So, on May 12th, Karl Knutsson and 800 well-equipped soldiers he had gathered to help evict Erik of Pomerania from Gotland set sail for Stockholm. 11 days later, they arrived. Few people were happy to see them, especially not the two new stewards, who worried that Karl Knutsson might be up to his old tricks, which, of course, is exactly what he was. In their desperation to make sure that Karl Knutsson wouldn't be allowed back into power, the stewards decided they wanted to pick a new king as quickly as possible. One of them should be elected for the top job, and then negotiate with the Danes to have them accept their candidate as king of all three kingdoms. Karl Knutsson most likely had a similar idea, or rather the opposite. If he wasn't able to wrest the stewardship away from the Oxenstiernas, he'd launch himself as a candidate for king and hope that his Danish relations and his deep pockets would be enough to get elected also in Denmark. So even though they originally weren't supposed to have elected a king at this meeting, only agreed on a candidate to discuss with the Danes later, things got out of hand in the tense situation. In the end, there was an election. It's unclear if all the estates were involved or if only the nobility did the electing, but in either case, the leading families dominated the proceedings, where Karl Knutsson stood against younger members of the Oxenstierna family. The election took place on June 20th, and the winner, by a wide margin, was Karl Knutsson Bonde. The Oxenstiernas and their allies could do nothing to stop his elevation, and 8 days later the formal confirmation took place at the Stones of Mora outside Uppsala. The following day he was crowned King of Sweden at Uppsala Cathedral. And just like that, the Swedes had elected and crowned a king of their own without consulting with the Danes. This was highly irregular and in violation of the treaties of the Union that they had all agreed should be respected only a few weeks ago. Some have interpreted this as an active attempt by the Swedes to break up the Kalmar Union and go it alone. This interpretation has been popular not least among historians who've seen the Union as a bad thing and its dissolution as a desirable outcome. But it's unlikely that this was the reason. Karl Knutsson and the men surrounding him didn't push for this, and it would have been against his own interests as well, since he belonged to one of these families with lands and relations on both sides of the Danish-Swedish border. But even though Karl Knutsson most likely wanted to retain the Union, he knew his position wasn't a particularly strong one. To strengthen said position, and to show he was a man of action, the newly crowned King Karl decided to go ahead with the invasion of Gotland that his predecessor Christopher had planned. So he took his fleet and 800 men and sailed south. In the middle of July, he and his troops landed on the island and took it fairly easily. But ex-King Erik and his forces still held the city of Visby and Visborg Castle. A stalemate developed that remained until December, but then the Swedes managed to sneak into the city and take it during a night raid. At that point, Erik agreed to leave Gotland in April the following year, handing the island back to Sweden. In Danish leading circles, everyone agreed that the Union should remain, but they were not particularly keen on a Swedish king, even one who had been able to finally get rid of Erik of Pomerania. No, they reasoned, Denmark was the leading state in the Union, the richest and the most powerful one. Surely they should have the right to pick a king that the Swedes and Norwegians should then accept. But even though the Danes all agreed that they didn't want Karl Knutsson to be their king, they were divided on the issue of who this new non-Swedish king should be. In an echo of Shakespeare, the leading families promoting different policies here were the Guildensterns and the Rosencrantzes. The Guildensterns wanted a local Danish nobleman to shoulder the burden of pan-Scandinavian kingship. They put forward two possible candidates who both, by sheer coincidence I assure you, happened to belong to the Guildenstern family. One of them was married to Karl Knutsson Bonde's daughter, by the way. But the Rosenkrantz faction argued that they needed an outsider, someone neutral and without an independent power base in Denmark, so it would be easier to guide them in their reign. They thought the Count of Holstein would be a good choice because that would also bring Schleswig back under the Danish crown after the Danes had lost that duchy in Erik of Pomerania's disastrous wars. The Count of Holstein also had excellent relations with the Hanseatic League, so picking him would ease the tension with the important German merchant organization. The Count himself actually declined the offer, but came back with a counter-offer. Why didn't the Danes pick his nephew, Christian of Oldenburg, instead? Christian might not have been an obvious choice. He was no prominent politician, and so far he hadn't made a name for himself as a great intellectual either. After Pope Sixtus IV had met him, he characterized Christian as a beautiful animal who couldn't speak, by which he meant that Christian didn't know Italian or Latin. Also, people with a more favorable impression of Christian tended to focus on his exterior, stressing that he was pleasant, tall, handsome, and pale. Christian may not have been a scholar or a wise statesman, but he had another thing going for him. He was single, so he could be made to marry Dorothea, King Christopher's widow. That way, the Danes wouldn't have to pay out her widow's pension that she was due, a widow's pension that was extremely generous and therefore was threatening to become ruinously expensive to the Danes. In the end, the Danish nobles decided to go for the dumb, pale, single guy, and on September 1st, Christian was elected by the Danish Council of the Realm. 4 weeks later, the election was confirmed at the traditional thing in Viborg. That meant that the Kalmar Union all of a sudden had 2 kings. And you don't have to be a constitutional expert to realize that this is at least one more than what's usually recommended for a friction-free government. The Danish and Swedish elites, who had sworn to protect the Union and who also didn't really have any reason to break it up, were now heading in exactly that direction. A breakup, and quite possibly war. The first flashpoint turned out to be Gotland. Eric of Pomerania had promised to leave and hand it back to Sweden, true, but only in April. So in early 1449, King Christian sent word to Eric that he would pay him handsomely if the ex-king would be willing to hand the castle over to the Danes instead. Christian even sent some Danish troops to beef up Eric's forces. When the Swedes realized what was going on, they resumed the siege of Visborg Castle, but in April, Eric officially handed the castle over to Denmark. Then he loaded his remaining ships with all the treasures he'd collected during his decade as a pirate and sailed home to Pomerania, a place he'd left as a 6-year-old boy over 50 years before when he'd been made heir to the formidable Margaret. He lived there for another 10 years, but he's now finally and definitely out of our story. After Christian had secured Danish control over Gotland, he shifted his focus westward to Norway. He wanted to make sure that even though if Sweden, in the worst-case scenario, would break out of the Union under its new King Karl, Norway should remain united with Denmark. In Norway, though, the thinking was different. The Norwegian Archbishop in Trondheim and other members of the Norwegian elites had followed the development, and they liked the way Sweden had safeguarded their autonomy vis-à-vis the king, and now they wanted to do the same. The Archbishop even dreamed of a Norwegian king, a guy called Sigurd Jonsson, who was both super rich, owning almost 1,000 farms, and the last living descendant of the old Norwegian royal family, albeit in a rather convoluted way. He was the son of the daughter of the son of Agnes, a daughter of King Haakon V, born out of wedlock. If you don't remember who Haakon V was, I recommended episode 45, Lawmender and Sons, to refresh your memory. Anyway, Sigurd wasn't interested. Maybe he lacked the political ambition and was just happy to live off the income from his 1,000 farms. Or maybe he realized that Norway wasn't strong enough to win a war against Denmark. Or maybe a little of column A and a little of column B. Either way, it was back to the drawing board for the Archbishop. And as far as the Archbishop was concerned, the next best thing to a Norwegian king was to have the Swedish king rule over Norway as well, since the Swedish king was weaker politically than his Danish counterpart. That would mean more autonomy for Norway. But not everyone agreed with the Archbishop that it would be so great if Karl Knutsson would become king of Norway. These people included many of the Danish noblemen that Eric and Christopher had appointed to various key positions in Norway, such as the Bishop of Oslo and the commander of Akerhus Castle in Oslo. The majority of the Norwegian Council of the Realm supported this view, and on March 1st, 1449, just as the more clement spring weather made it possible to sail across Skagerrak in reasonable safety, they sent off a delegation to Denmark to initiate negotiations for Christian to become king of Norway as well as Denmark. But at the same time, some of the members of the minority of the council, backed by some other Norwegian nobles, decided that they were going to try to make Karl Knutsson king of Norway anyway, in order to, as they said, safeguard Norway's liberty, law and privileges. In other words, two different factions within the upper crust of the Norwegian elite were actively courting two different kings, trying to make them accept the Norwegian crown. What could possibly go wrong in that situation? Well, Christian was first on the ball. He arrived in Norway at midsummer 1449 and was elected King of Norway in exchange for promising to rule the kingdom in cooperation with the Council of the Realm and not to appoint any commanders or governors who weren't either Norwegians or at the very least married into Norwegian noble families. When that deal was done and dusted, Christian boarded his ship and sailed back to Denmark, satisfied that Norway was now his. But the people supporting Karl Knutsson's candidacy hadn't given up. They convinced two regional things to elect Karl Knutsson King of Norway that same summer. Encouraged by the apparent strong support he enjoyed in Norway, Karl Knutsson himself gathered an army, and in October he crossed the border into Norway. He was greeted enthusiastically by the local nobility and ecclesiastical elites in Hamar in the border regions, and he was elected king also by two regional things north of Oslo that fall. Karl Knutsson then marched across the highland toward the coast and Trondheim, the center of Norwegian religion, seat of the Norwegian archbishop, who supported the anti-Danish faction in the struggle for the Norwegian throne. The Swedish king and his entourage reached Trondheim in November after a rather chilly march across the mountainous Norwegian interior, and after having been elected king at the thing in Trøndelag as well, Karl Knutsson was officially crowned King of Norway by the Archbishop in late November in the splendid Nidaros Cathedral, supposedly built on the spot where St. Olav was buried. Then Karl Knutsson returned to Sweden, arriving back in Stockholm a week or so before Christmas. He was decidedly happy about his situation. He was now crowned king of both Sweden and Norway, whereas Christian hadn't actually had a coronation in Norway. So Karl felt that he had the upper hand there. But even though he'd been crowned in Trondheim, Karl knew Christian wasn't going to let him have Norway just like that. There would have to be a final showdown between Karl and Christian, deciding who would be top dog. On May 1st, 12 representatives each appointed by Karl and Christian met in Halmstad in what was then northeastern Denmark, but what's today a port town on the Swedish west coast. The purpose of this meeting was to try and avoid all-out war between Denmark and Sweden, and instead reach a diplomatic solution. It may be tempting to think of the 24 men who met as implacable nationalists, hell-bent at fighting for the benefit of their respective homelands. But most of them were actually supporters of the seemingly moribund Kalmar Union. Two of the Swedish delegates were actually Danes. The half-brother of one of those Danes was a leading member of the Danish delegation. They all realized that they couldn't actually re-establish the Union right now, but they reached an agreement stating that when either Karl or Christian would die, delegations from the two kingdoms would meet again and try to agree on letting the survivor inherit his dead opponent's vacant crown. If that wouldn't be possible, a steward would be elected to fill the vacancy, and once the second king would die too, delegations from the two kingdoms would meet again to try and agree on a common king. So, the issue of succession was handled rather elegantly and without either Karl or Christian having to yield to the other. But in the Norwegian question, Christian came out on top. Even though Karl had been elected king at several things and had even been crowned king by the Archbishop of Norway himself late the previous year, Christian held all the most important castles in Norway. So Karl really didn't stand any realistic chance of taking Norway by force. Karl Knutsson had to renounce his claim to the Norwegian crown, and from Halmstad, Christian sailed to Trondheim, where he was crowned King of Norway in Nidaros Cathedral on the symbolically important St. Olav's Day, July 29th, 1450. The anti-Danish archbishop, who'd crowned Karl King of Norway less than 10 months earlier, was spared the humiliation of crowning Christian King of Norway thanks to his well-timed death only a few days before this new coronation. So Karl Knutsson had now definitely lost Norway, and to make matters worse, his position in Sweden wasn't very strong either. He'd been defeated by Christian, and he worried that his domestic enemies would smell blood in the water and come after him. So Karl Knutsson decided to strike first, attacking members of the nobility who'd supported Christian, or who, in Karl's mind, hadn't supported him vigorously enough. As you may remember from previous episodes, Karl Knutsson was definitely not a forgive and forget kind of guy. This did nothing to improve Karl Knutsson's popularity back home, even though the open opposition may have fallen silent. and just as there was a number of Norwegian nobles coming to Sweden after the defeat of the anti-Danish faction there, some Swedish noblemen thought it would be best for their health to relocate south of the border to Denmark. At the same time, Christian wasn't 100% happy with the current state of affairs either. Sure, after Halmstad, he was now king of Denmark and Norway, but he wanted to re-establish the whole Kalmar Union and take the Swedish crown as well. And he wasn't interested in waiting until Karl Knutsson died. So he started to raise troops in Germany, gathering a large force of knights that he planned to send to Sweden and take the country, either by military force or by the threat of military force. Karl Knutsson knew what was happening south of the Baltic Sea, but he didn't have the resources to go on a massive shopping spree for foreign knights to counter Christian. Instead, he'd have to rely on domestic troops, mostly farmers who were part-time soldiers at best. During the peasant revolts of the 1430s, these troops had proven to be of some use, but Karl was far from confident that they'd be much to put up against a professional army. Things looked bleak for Karl Knutsson. There's a silver lining to relying exclusively on local troops, though. They're there when you need them. That meant that Karl Knutsson was able to make the first move. He gathered a large, albeit not so professional, force in southern Sweden in January 1452, and led by scouts on skis and following the banner of St. George, this army set off through the winter landscape across the border into Denmark. They eventually reached Helsingborg on the eastern shore of the Øresund Strait, virtually unopposed. Instead of wasting time trying to capture the strong castle there, Karl Knutsson just burned the town to the ground before moving south along the coast to Landskrona. That town opened its gates to the Swedes, and so it avoided Helsingborg's fiery fate. Karl Knutsson summoned the Danish archbishop from Lund and the Scandinavian nobility to Landskrona, most likely in an attempt to try and convince them to switch sides and thereby winning Scania for Sweden. But the archbishop and the nobles didn't bother to answer his summons. This infuriated Karl Knutsson, so he let his military expedition turn into a campaign of pillaging and destruction. Much of western Scania was put to the torch, and the archbishop was especially targeted. Karl Knutsson took his castle Borgeby, and after spending one night there, he burnt it down. The city of Lund, the official seat of the archbishop, was also pillaged, even though the cathedral itself, as well as the archbishop's castle, withstood the attack thanks to its strong walls. From there, the Swedes continued northeast, torching towns that weren't willing to pay extortion money to avoid being burnt down. By late February, Karl Knutsson's forces crossed the border back into Sweden. They had failed to take Scania, and now all they could do was to wait for the Danish counterattack. That attack came in the early summer. Christian and his army stood in Halland, ready to cross the border into western Sweden, and at the same time, Danish forces on the island of Gotland were preparing a fake attack on Stockholm, tricking the Swedes to divide their troops. In addition to being divided, the Swedish defense was also half-hearted. Many of the leading men, both within the nobility and the church in southern Sweden, disliked the split between Denmark and Sweden. They had enjoyed the cross-border trade and travel during the golden years of the Kalmar Union, and they feared that a prolonged war would take place on their lands, ruining them. So when the Danish army crossed into southern Sweden from Halland, it met little resistance. Västrogothia fell without almost any fighting at all, and a thing was called where Christian was elected king instead of Karl Knutsson. Then the Danes moved on to repeat this feat in Ostrogothia in eastern Sweden as well. But to get there, they had to pass through an area of wooded and hilly terrain called the Hålaveden forest. There, the German mounted knights, fighting for Christian, found that the local peasants had blocked the narrow road with barricades. That discovery was soon followed by an even more unpleasant one. The peasant soldiers had taken up positions in hiding places among the trees along both sides of the road, and now started to shoot at the long, strung-out column of knights. The Karl Chronicle, written to glorify Karl Knutsson and his reign, gleefully records how the stings of the arrows burned the Danes, The Germans cursed having been lured to Sweden, and King Christian was so desperate that he called upon the devil in German. Karl Knutsson and his peasant army had managed to stave off a complete collapse of the Swedish defences, but that didn't mean they'd won the war. Far from it. In the end, the sides agreed on a 2-year truce, where large parts of southern and western Sweden were left in Danish hands. To make matters worse, Karl Knutsson was also worried by the behavior of the Swedish nobles and some bishops who had been so unwilling to fight against Christian. In fact, following the truce, another wave of Swedish noblemen left Sweden for Denmark, and Karl Knutsson didn't know how many of the remaining ones he could trust. Did I say worried? I meant furious. The noblemen who Karl still thought had betrayed him and let the country down were put on trial. Most of the accused had already fled the country and were safe beyond the Danish border, but 2 were arrested. One of them, the same man who'd burned rebellious peasants for Karl Knutsson back in 1438, had his head put on a spike and his body entwined in a wheel as a last posthumous humiliation. The second arrested traitor was a more delicate case. It was a woman, and not just any woman. Her name was Märta Olofsdotter, and she was the wife of a member of the Council of the Realm and daughter of the commander of the Danish forces. She'd written letters to her Danish relations revealing Swedish war plans, and these letters had been intercepted and brought to Karl Knutsson. There was no doubt that she was guilty, and so she was sentenced to burn at the stake. But not even Karl Knutsson could execute such a high-profile woman, so in the end she was pardoned and would go on to live for more than another 40 years. Danish and Swedish nobles, especially those owning land in the border zone where most of the potential future war would most likely take place, spent the truce trying to convince the 2 kings to reach some kind of compromise or deal like the one they'd agreed on in Halmstad. But neither Karl nor Christian were interested in compromises anymore. Christian had decided that this time he was going to crush Karl Knutsson, and so he spent the truce replenishing his supply of foreign knights and building an alliance against Sweden. He gave the Hanseatic League far-reaching trading privileges in Norway and Denmark in 1455 in order to make the League pro-Danish. He also made an alliance with the Teutonic Order. The order wasn't particularly strong at this point, quite the opposite actually, but this way at least Christian managed to rob Sweden of a potential ally in the Baltic Sea region. Open war recommenced in the summer of 1455, and despite Christian's skillful diplomatic maneuvering, it was the Swedes who opened strongest. They managed to take the new fortress the Danes had constructed in southern Sweden, and that they'd hoped would serve as a starting off point for the Danish army pushing even further north into Sweden. The Karl Chronicle, with its usual taste for schadenfreude, remarks that the fortress called Danaborg, meaning Castle of the Danes, should more fittingly have been called Danasorg, or Sorrow of the Danes. As the Swedish army advanced southward, retaking land the Danes had captured 2 years previously, noblemen who'd collaborated with Christian were arrested and put to death. And we're not only talking about peripheral minor nobility. No one was spared. Even the father of a member of the Council of the Realm was executed by Karl Knutsson. When all the old Swedish lands had been recaptured, the army pushed west across the border and conquered Bohuslän and Viken, 2 regions in southeastern Norway as well. All in all, 1455 turned out to be a great year for Karl Knutsson. He'd taken back all the territory lost to the Danes 2 years previously, and he'd exacted revenge against all treacherous nobles he'd been able to lay his hands on. But that was as far as his luck would stretch. In 1456, the commander of the Swedish army was killed, and then the setbacks came one after the other. The Danes started by conquering the island of Öland in the Baltic Sea, and together with the military defeats, domestic opposition was also growing. To finance the war, Karl Knutsson had not only raised taxes for the common people, but he'd also increased import duties and even started a process of reclaiming former crown lands that had been donated to the church. That meant that the peasants, burghers, and clerics now joined the nobility who was already skeptical of Karl Knutsson's reign. Things reached a breaking point the following winter when a rebellion against Karl Knutsson erupted. And this wasn't yet another peasant rebellion. No, it was led by the Archbishop himself, who wasn't just the most important cleric in Sweden, but also the most senior member of the Council of the Realm. In a scene that was filled with medieval drama, the Archbishop strode up to the high altar in Uppsala Cathedral, took off his mitre, that's the funny hat that bishops wear as a sign of their office, and placed it in front of the reliquary containing the bones of Saint Eric, declaring that he'd wear the mitre again only when Sweden was once again ruled according to its proper laws. Then he put on a harness, picked up his sword, and walked out of the cathedral to gather his troops to go fight the king. The uprising was popular, and it spread like wildfire from Uppsala in all directions. As usual, Karl Knutsson reacted with fury and set out to meet the rebellious archbishop on the battlefield, which he did outside Strängnäs on the southern shore of Lake Mälaren, maybe 50 kilometers west of Stockholm as the crow flies. Karl Knutsson's hope to crush the rebellion with a swift victory didn't pan out, though. On the contrary, his forces were beaten, and Karl Knutsson himself was wounded and had to retreat to Stockholm, where he hid behind the safety of the city walls. But that safety soon proved to be precarious. The burghers of Stockholm weren't particularly fond of Karl Knutsson and his policies, and they were definitely not willing to suffer a siege to keep him on the throne. So after a few days when he'd received a steady stream of reports of new regions joining in the rebellion against him, Karl Knutsson decided it was time to leave when he still could. So he loaded a ship with as much gold and other valuables as he could get his hands on. Then he and some of his relatives and closest allies set sail in the middle of the night of February 23rd, braving the Baltic Sea in midwinter rather than the approaching army led by the Archbishop. The following morning, February 24th, Stockholm flung open its gates to the Archbishop, who could enter in triumph. A few days later, the exiled Karl Knutsson arrived in the Hanseatic city of Danzig, today's Gdansk in Poland, where he was welcome to settle. The burghers of Danzig were especially interested in all that gold and riches he brought with him, because they were involved in a conflict with the Teutonic Knights at the time. But even though Karl Knutsson was out of the country, that doesn't mean he's out of our story quite yet. From Danzig, Karl Knutsson would plot his revenge and try to return to Sweden, no matter how long it would take. We'll have reason to return to him in the future. For now, though, Sweden is leaderless, and next time, King Christian in Copenhagen will step in to capitalize on this state of affairs. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history, which, let's face it, is everywhere. Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words," or "Be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page or on Twitter. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.